Hi, I'm John Stevenson, and we're going to be looking at God's preparation of a deliverer in our study of Exodus chapter 2, verses 1 through 10. Back in Exodus chapter 1, we had the telling of the Israelites and their general bondage in Egypt. Now as we come to chapter 2, the focus comes upon one specific family and their dealings with that Egyptian bondage. Back in Exodus 1, the Israelites were multiplying. Now in chapter 2, a man and a woman have a son. In chapter 1, the Pharaoh orders the male children to be thrown into the river. And now in chapter 2, we're going to see the Pharaoh's daughter drawing Moses out of that river. In Exodus 1, it showed us Pharaoh's plan for the Israelite extinction. The Pharaoh wanted to get rid of the Israelites. Here in chapter 2, we see God's plan for Israelite redemption. Exodus 2, chapter 2, verse 1, Now a man from the house of Levi went and married a daughter of Levi. The woman conceived and bore a son, and when she saw that he was beautiful, literally the Hebrew says he was tov, he was good, she hid him for 3 months. But when she could hide him no longer, she got him a wicker basket, and covered it over with tar and pitch, and then she put the child into it and set it among the reeds by the bank of the Nile. His sister stood at a distance. Have you noticed that no names have been given? There was a man, there was a woman, there is her the little boy's sister, and we're going to see their names later on in the book of Exodus, but they're absent here. There's a sort of an air of anonymity to the entire story. It's as though the parents are trying to be secretive, and they've brought us, the reader, into that mode of secrecy as we are protecting, as it were, their anonymity. So his sister stood at a distance to find out what would happen to him. Now notice they had placed the child into what's described as a wicker basket, a tiba. And that's the same word that we saw back in Genesis chapter 6 when Noah was commanded to build a tiba, an ark. And of course an ark, an ark saves lives. It's a word for a box. It can be a really small box like this one, or it can be a really big box like the one that Noah was making. They save lives, and they're meant to float, and they're covered with pitch. But it seems to be an Egyptian loan word. And so there's a certain commonality between this ark and the ark that is back in the book of Genesis. There's other phrases, too, that are reminiscent of the opening chapters of the book of Genesis, where she gave birth to this child, this male child, and she saw that he was good. And you remember how Genesis starts off, where God created and he saw that it was good. And that's seen all throughout Genesis chapter 1. Remember how the Israelites, they are multiplying and they're in the land and it's filled with them. Likewise, we have the command back in Genesis chapter 1 to multiply and fill the earth. So that in the Moses story, we're supposed to read it, and I think we're supposed to be reminded of the story of Noah. Noah had been ordered to build an ark, and now the mother of Moses gets him and gets a basket, a tiba, an ark, and places him within it. In the case of Noah, it was going to protect Noah and his family and the animals from the destruction of the flood. Here, in the case of the ark of Moses, it will protect Moses from the destruction that is mandated by the orders of the Pharaoh. In the case of Noah, he was delivered from the waters of the flood. In the case of Moses, he is delivered from the waters of the Nile. And so the story develops where the daughter of Pharaoh, now the Pharaoh would have had any number of daughters, so I don't think we ought to try to say, well, it was this daughter or that daughter, and try to necessarily put a name to it. That cause is probably hopeless unless there are more archaeological discoveries. But the daughter of Pharaoh came down to bathe at the Nile with her handmaidens, walking alongside the Nile, and she saw the basket. I think it's humorous. The Pharaoh had said, throw all the babies into the Nile, and they had fashioned this little basket in which to keep the baby safe. and they had complied with the orders of the Pharaoh. He's in the Nile. Of course, he's got a babysitter standing by. And here's the daughter of the Pharaoh. She saw the basket among the reeds and sent her maids, and she brought it to her. And when she opened it, she saw the child, and behold, the boy was crying. And she had pity on him. And she recognized him. She says, "This is one of the Hebrews' children." Well, then his sister said to Pharaoh's daughter, "Shall I go and call a nurse for you from the Hebrew woman, that she may nurse the child for you?" And Pharaoh's daughter says, "That's a good idea. Go ahead." So the girl went and called the child's mother. And then the Pharaoh's daughter said to her, "Take this child away and nurse him for me, and I will give you wages." So she's instructed by the daughter of the Pharaoh, "You take care of this child, you nurse the child, and I will pay you for what will essentially be taking care of your own child." And so the woman took the child and nursed him. Now it's interesting to note the different characters in Exodus chapters 1-2 that are used by God to save this little child. Back in chapter 1, we had the midwives that were lying to the Pharaoh, and God had blessed them. And here we see the parents of Moses who hide him for several months. And then there's his sister, unnamed sister. She's named later on. We're going to find out this Miriam. And she's standing watch, and she's helping to orchestrate the entire thing. And then there's the Pharaoh's daughter, who just happens to come to the right river at the right time and see the child and have compassion upon him. And there's even the maidens who fetch the basket, who the Pharaoh's daughter sends out, "Bring the basket here." All of them are involved in accomplishing the will of God. And so we read, the child grew, and she brought him to Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son. And she named him Moses, and said, "Because I drew him out of the water." Now, that name Moses has significance in both Hebrew as well as in the Egyptian language. In Hebrew, it means to draw out. And so the name in Hebrew has that idea, because I drew him out of the water. But in Egyptian, it also has significance as a child. I suppose you could say a child is drawn out of his mother. And there are names during this same 18th dynasty, and going into the 19th dynasty too, but in this 18th dynasty of Egypt, there's Kamoses and Amoses and Thutmoses, and eventually in the 19th dynasty we'll even see a Ramesses, or Ramoses, I guess we could say. And in each case, it's the child of Ka, or the child of Ah, or the child of Thut, or the child of Ra. And so in both cases, it has meaning both to draw out and the child. But the name has greater significance than that, because this child eventually is going to grow up, and he will be used by God to draw the Israelites out of Egypt. And in that, he reminds us of Jesus, who came to earth to draw us out of our sin and to connect us with God.